Hello, everyone. Um, okay, so we're going to review time period 1 and 2 today. And I know you guys, those of you in my class, have already watched a lot of videos on this, so I'll be really brief. And then I think Miss Leeton's going to do time period 3 for you guys for later in the week. I will put this whole PowerPoint on Google Classroom for you guys. So I'm going through really quickly. You guys will have the ability to go back and look at that as much as you need to. Okay, so when we talk about time period 1 and 2, we're talking about time period 1 is 1491 to 1607. And remember, 1491 is because the College Board wants you to be sure and think about Native Americans prior to European contact, and then 1607 is founding of Jamestown. And then time period 2 starts in 1607, founding of Jamestown, first permanent English settlement on the continent, and 1754 is chosen because that's the French and Indian War. Okay, so real quickly we'll go through the one thing you probably need to know from time period 1 is just maybe the different regions and what type of Native Americans lived there and how they adapted to their environments. So the first region is the Southwest region. And I'm sure you remember from world history, the great city there, which is present day Mexico City, that had almost 250,000 residents there. Corn was their main crop, and they practiced settled agriculture there. They had advanced irrigation systems and a lot of social diversification among their societies. Yeah, let's see, let's go. Okay, then if we go to the Great Plains and the Great Basin, and you can refer back to the map if you need to know what I'm talking about. They were very mobile because it was dry and arid, and so they couldn't do settled agriculture, and they hunted buffalo, and all of these Native American societies were matriarchal societies. We'll talk about how that differs from the English and Europeans in a little bit. The horse is really going to change their lifestyle, makes them more mobile, more efficient at warfare, and can travel greater distances. The Northeast and the Northwest. In the Northeast, that was the Mississippi River Valley area, and all along the Atlantic seaboard. We talked about three sister farming, where you'd have squash, beans, and corn all in one place, so that they had mixed societies, settled agriculture and hunter-gatherer. And of course, they used what they had. They had these long houses rather than teepees like they had out on the Great Plains. In the Northwest, we're talking about present-day California, hunting and gathering, some settled communities, a lot of resources there that they used from the ocean. All right, now let's move on to colonial America. The first thing that the Crash Course book, and this is the book I'm referring to, and you're going to have a link to it, a PDF version of it, is what this PowerPoint was made from and what we use for review. So be sure to know the Iroquois Confederacy, which was a very powerful group of Native Americans that formed a confederacy there in the East. That would be the New York area. The Five Nations, Mohawk, Seneca, you can read that there. Let's see, it was a political alliance so that they would have more bargaining power, ended some tribal warfare between those groups. All right, the differences between Native Americans and English settlers, the main differences are going to be like what I talked about before, that Native American societies were matriarchal, whereas European societies were patriarchal. So be sure you know the difference between those two. Also, one big conflict is going to be over the idea of land ownership. Europeans believed in the idea of private ownership of property, whereas Native Americans were more believed in the collective ownership of property. Also, different religions. You've got European countries being monotheistic, and Native Americans being polytheistic or animalistic in their religion. Okay, we spent a lot of time in class talking about the differences between the southern colonies and the New England colonies, and then of course you have the middle colonies. So I would make sure that you go back and know the differences between those. But let's start with the plantation colonies, which we're talking about the Chesapeake area. I hope you remember the two colonies that were considered Chesapeake colonies. Wait for it. Yes, Maryland, right, and Virginia. Okay, first one we want to talk about is the Virginia Company. Virginia's founded as a joint stock company. Go back and refresh on the joint stock company. They shared the cost and they shared the profits. Tobacco is what's going to save the Chesapeake colonies and make them economically viable. Let's see. Remember, they needed a labor force, and so the first labor force that we talked about was indentured servitude, and that means where a landowner would have paid for your passage to come over, and then you were indebted to that landowner typically for about 7 years to be able to pay off your debt. A lot of them didn't make it through their indenture because it was a lot of hard work. The headright system, for each indentured servant you brought over, you got 50 acres of land, so they accumulated a lot of land really quickly. Bacon's Rebellion happens in 1676. That's where those former indentured servants who because by the time you get to 1676, one of the things indentured servants got when they got finished with their indenture was that they received land. By the time you get to the late 1600s, they're not even receiving land, and so you had a lot of former indentured servants who have no land, no women, no economic prospects, and there was this tension between the rich and the poor, and so Bacon leads a rebellion, burns down Jamestown, and the biggest effect of that is that it's going to change the labor system, and we're going to see a switch over to slave labor rather than indentured servitude. So go back and refresh on all of that. Slavery develops and spreads because of the cultivation of tobacco, and it'll be legally established in all of the 13 colonies by the 1700s. Rice is going to be the most important crop in South Carolina during the 18th century. Be sure to know the Stono Rebellion. It was one of the earliest known acts of rebellion. Let's see, it was slaves that were living in Charleston that tried to get to Spanish Florida, but it wasn't successful, but sometimes they like to test about that. If you remember in class, we read excerpts from John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill. These are the Puritans that came, very much different than the establishment of Jamestown. Jamestown was for profit. The Puritans came to build a model Christian society. Very strict moral code of conduct, no separation of church and state. They believed that laws only existed to enforce God's laws. Remember the famous quote there, the eyes of the world are upon us. Remember the two dissenters that we talked about in class that AP likes to test about, Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams, who both get kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony for not abiding by the laws of the colony there. Anne Hutchinson was holding her own Bible studies. That really was offensive. And then Roger Williams, and remember, she goes to New York, and I think she and her kids all get attacked by Indians or something and dies. Roger Williams then goes on to found Rhode Island. As you see time progressing, you had fewer and fewer membership in the church, and so that had diluted over time, and so they had to come up with the halfway covenant, like you were a partial member. Anyway, this is all going to lead to the First Great Awakening, which takes place in the 1730s. Remember, we have a First Great Awakening and we have a Second Great Awakening. You had New Light ministers who were the opposite of the old light ministers, but some of the consequences of the First Great Awakening are going to be the establishment of these institutions of higher learning, a renewed missionary spirit, more religious diversity, and women participating more in church congregations. Let me make sure I didn't leave anything out here. Oh, the New Light ministers had that more emotional approach to preaching than the Old Light ministers. Let's see. Okay, let's move on to Pennsylvania, established by William Penn. It was a much more liberal colony. They had a representative assembly. It was a lot of Quakers there, freedom of religion. Quakers were pacifists. They were abolitionists, remember, opposed to slavery, one of the first examples of that. And women had a greater role in society there. Let's see. Okay, even though you did have rich and poor in the colonial societies, when we get closer to into the 1700s, it wasn't a hereditary aristocracy like it was in Europe. So there was still lots of economic opportunity. And so you're going to see immigration, particularly from the Scotch-Irish and the Germans. But a lot of them are going to move into like the Appalachia area, move a little bit further. The 13 colonies were religiously diverse. You can go back, remember we did a chart where we compared all the southern, middle, and New England colonies, and there's tons of videos out there comparing the different regions of the colonies that I would suggest you go back and watch. Let's see. Oh, mercantilism and the Navigation Acts. Remember mercantilism, mother country, if you've watched Mr. Norris. Mercantilism wanted a favorable balance of trade, meaning that the mother country wanted to export more than what they imported. So they expected raw goods to come from the colonies to go to the mother country, and then they would produce manufactured goods, and the colonies become a place to sell those manufactured goods. Women in colonial America, you lost your property when you got married, no separate legal identity. The only people that could own, the only women that can own property are going to be if you were single or if you were a widow. The idea of republicanism, meaning that the governed only have people that are governing them because they've given them the consent to be governed. Sovereignty comes from the people. And remember how we talked about Republican motherhood, that idea of the importance of the mother in the home because she's raising the next generation of citizens that had to practice civic virtue to have a good republic. All right, so I think I really only hit the high notes there. But I don't want the video to be too long. Like I said, you can go back through the PowerPoint. It's going to be posted. I encourage you to, this book is in a PDF version. This guy, Larry Krieger, who wrote this book, analyzed the AP exams for years past to see what were the most tested subjects, and he only put those in this book. And so that's why we use it. It's simple. It kind of breaks it down to the most basic things that you need to know. So I hope you're having a good week. If you have questions, just email me. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks. Bye.